We're going to begin this week by looking at literature in a different context as we try to understand what it was responding to. So, in order to do that, I put together this presentation, and it will be required for you to kind of look through this presentation and analyze it for your homework. So, I would suggest just kind of paying attention and taking note of the questions and observations because embedded throughout with each artist, we're going to be kind of pondering on its connection to Willa Cather's text. So, to begin, we're going to look at the frontier period and westward expansion through art. The first artist we're going to look at is William Rainey. His art is often narrative, depicting unnamed characters who suggest the power of the individual to contribute to an American character. This is very similar to what Cather did. She used individuals, so Antonia, as well as Lena and Langard and some of the others, to talk about how the individual has power and how they become American over time through their investment in society and social causes. So what this author is also pursuing is kind of who these characters are and what they depict as a part of the American story. So what do these characters in the painting suggest about Westering for experienced and inexperienced pioneers? So Westering was sort of like that living in the West, rooting yourself, traveling West, everything having to do with that. So what do we learn through this image about what it was like to be an individual during this time period? This is called Advice on the Prairie. And you're to imagine what the story is for each of these characters and how their lives might be talking about individualism and the American identity. Here's a second image he has called Rainy. It's called A Trapper Crossing the Mountains. All right, and now Thomas Cole is the second artist that we're going to look at. And the question to kind of ponder when you're looking at Thomas Cole's work is what features and details of pioneer life are obvious in his painting Home in the Woods? And where do you think that this homestead is located in the US? So we're looking at features of pioneer life. So this is kind of the overview, and then we'll zoom in for a second on the actual characters. But take a minute and look at the setting. It doesn't portray the setting as harsh. It portrays the setting as conquered. If you look at these trees close to the front, you can see that they had been felled. And based on that, the question would be, what characteristics would enable somebody to be successful in this setting? You have to be strong. You have to have traits of perseverance and dominance over nature and all of its forces. Here you see a very old person. There's a young woman standing in the doorway with some children. You see various animals. There's little chicks on the ground and bigger chickens, and then they had some livestock, and the man was out fishing. So again, what does this say about the human character and the human spirit? He moved to Albert Bierstadt. He was known for his huge unsettled Western landscapes. He was himself a German immigrant to the United States. We're going to look at why in his pictures do migrants going west have a difficulty finding these scenes. He's going to portray the scenes in sort of their perfection, in their perfect state. And why were these landscapes kind of what people had in their mind, and why were they unrealistic? What hopes do they inspire, and how did they appeal to viewers? So if settlers or people in the East saw these images, what would have appealed to them? Just take a minute and look at it and think about it. You have an abundance of natural resources and food and space. In this one, this is called the Gates of Yosemite. So with Bierstadt, these are kind of the images that the those moving west had in their mind. Why is that unrealistic? Next, we have Jasper Cropsey. His landscape itself was vast. It portrayed natural beauty. It was altered by man's dominion over nature in the forms of a viaduct and the train. The man and his dog stand looking at the scene, and the question is, what's more intriguing, nature's beauty or man's ingenuity? When you look at this, is this a picture of the triumph of humanity, or is nature still the victor? Next, George Inez, what does the painting suggest about the relationship between deforestation and the Transcontinental Railroad? So we need to look at the village, discuss what and who are on the wrong side of the tracks, and how American towns changed when railroads came through them. What facets of civilized society are located in the town opposite of the rail station? And why does the boy in the foreground watch the train's progress? Um, it's a bit hard to see. Go back to that for a second. But you have two different kind of settlements, and the train splits through them. You're welcome to look up the image if you want to see it in more detail, because there are a lot of sources where you can actually zoom in. And then here's the boy that it's talking about, and all of these trees have been felled and taken away. What's that relationship? Is that called progress? Or is that the kind of, does that reflect negatively on sort of American idealisms to conquer and to control? Next, we have Emmanuel Gottlieb. As kind of you're looking through this, I want you to interpret the scene, showing the reasons for pioneering, the hardships, and the triumphs. And so within this painting, there are so many different scenes. There are things going on in the border sections. This is sort of more the reality. Each of these smaller sections of the painting have a ton of information being communicated. And so if you take the time to look up the image, you can actually zoom in and try to identify what's going on here. But each of these scenes are intending to show why people went out, what they faced in terms of hardships, and then the triumphs that they faced as well. Andrew Melrose, again, this is another portrait of the deforestation. In fact, in the East, there were a lot of environmentalists who saw the railroad as a threat to nature. And that's sort of, environmentalism is not a new concept. And we'll look at a couple biographies in a bit to kind of look at how people perceived this process. But what do you believe is the appeal of transcontinental train travel and empire versus the ecological losses? And so here's his image called Westward, the star of empire takes its way. And all along you just see stumps and you see animals being threatened. And here's sort of the light of progress, the light of empire. What statement does this make to you? So William Jewett, his portrayal of the Grayson family and their promised land suggests that the vista before them could all be theirs. What changes are they having to make? What are they willing to do in order to inhabit this land? Discuss the dress of the husband versus that of his wife and daughter. What civilized gender traits are laid upon each of these family members? So here you have the Grayson family. They're looking out over what could all be theirs. The husband is wearing skins, and so he looks a little bit more rugged. The woman is still maintaining her civilized attire. What did they have to face? What were they willing to do to conquer this land? Then you have Currier and Ives. They are very famous for their lithographs and pictures that depict Americana. They comment on the disasters of the day, what's being conveyed about cross-country train travel in this series, and why would these prints be popular? So the first that they show is the prairie fires of the Great West. What's being portrayed here? You have all of the bison in the background and the train plowing through. This is called The Route to California. American Railroad Scene. And obviously the subtitle is Snowbound. It's part of this series. What does this show you about humanity, about human nature, about what was required through to the Pacific? This is empire being built. What do we think about this? And lastly, John Gast. One mark of civilization is social, political, and cultural advancement. In this painting, what or who represents progress? Who is not progressing in their work? What is the plight of those who are deemed uncivilized? And so this is, again, that idea of the manifest destiny, that God intended us to have this land. And in order to have it, what do we have to do? We have to chase out those who are, quote, uncivilized. So American progress, as it comes to the West, it pushes out those who are deemed unworthy. So for your homework, you are going to be asked to kind of review this, as well as look at some songs that I posted for you guys to kind of look at, like, accompany this period. And then there's some artist biographies, and you're going to respond to the questions that are posed in the presentation. 5 of the 10, so not all of the questions. But what this is doing, and it's helping you understand that part of the way that we interpret literature is not just reading the text all by itself, but looking around it to see what else was being produced, so that we can have an idea of who else and what else was capturing these same themes, so we can get more of a holistic picture of the message that Willa Cather was attempting to communicate. And just a couple of notes from 2 of the author's biographies. We have Albert Bierstadt, and again, he was the German immigrant, and one of the things that he kind of encapsulated was that Americans were eager to see the mountains. A generation of travelers had been described as America's Alps. And so within 3 months, he had moved to America, and he completed a lot of scenes of the Rocky Mountains, Lender's Peak. But what I want you to specifically look at is that the American landscape was taking place in light of a war-torn nation. There was this golden image of their own promised land. So after the Civil War and everything was destroyed, they were looking for a new hope. And so that was sort of the promise of the westward expansion. And then we have this one. This is William Rennie. And I think it's important to look at the phrasing that he used to talk about his portraits. When he was the narratives resonated with an American public that eagerly sought out images and stories. So the American public looked at this. They looked at Cather's stories because they wanted to hear what was happening in the West, and what did it look like. Critics saw his pictures as thoroughly American, a trait highly valued as nationalistic fervor swept across the United States. This patriotic spirit burns in his historical subjects. And then the last one I want us to look at, a phrase from Thomas Cole. And it said that it was during this period he began his relationship with another patron that would pay him to paint images. And he produced one of his best-known series called The Course of Empire. He was working on this idea of what did it look like to conquer. And during that time, the growth of the railroad by, quote, copper-hearted barbarians was a particular concern. And so I wanted you to note that people were not all unanimously in favor of what was going on with the railroad and western expansion. So that's kind of some context, and I want you to try to figure out how Willa Cather's text can be brought to life a little bit more with these images and an understanding of the art history that supplements the literary history. And if you're brave, the musical history as well, as I linked a couple of funny songs. So enjoy.